welcome to everyone on behalf of the Zinn Education Project for our class on a Black women's history of the United States. Happy International Women's Day from us today too. How beautiful and how powerful it is that we get to share this virtual space, especially on today. Some of you are joining for the first time, and some have participated in our spring series, and some of you have participated in all of our online classes. It truly is a gift to be able to share this time together, and I thank you for being in virtual community with us. My name is Cierra Kaler-Jones. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Education Anew Fellow with Communities for Just Schools Fund and Teaching for Change. I'm also a community-based educator and a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland in College Park. The Zinn Education Project is hosting this session today and offers free downloadable people's histories lessons that many of you have used. I've used many of them myself for middle and high school classrooms from the Zinn Education Project website. We have a campaign to teach the Black freedom struggle. This online class is part of that larger campaign. Today, we are joined by ASL interpreters, Crystal Butler and Tariba Royal. We're so grateful to them for being with us and for interpreting this conversation this evening. And so before we begin our conversation, we want to find out who is in the room and go through our plans for our time together. We're going to do a quick poll to find out how many teachers, librarians, teacher educators, historians, parents and caregivers, students, and others who are in the room with us. Many of you are in multiple roles, so please just pick your primary one. We will post a poll, as you may see on your screen, for you to respond to. If for some reason technology is not working for you and you're not able to see the poll, please do continue to introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you, and we are glad that you're here. Throughout the session, we want you to use the chat box, post questions, comments, resources, and ideas. We will read your questions, and our guest speakers will try to respond after the breakout rooms. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have together. We'll also do a short evaluation at the end. Please continue the conversation on Twitter. We encourage you to share your learnings and your insights using the hashtag #TeachBlackFreedomStruggle. And now I think we're ready to see the poll results to see how many folks are in the room with us. Wow, okay, so we have 56% educators, 18% teacher educators, 7% students, yes. We have 2% are historians, 4% community or labor organizers, 2% primary family member, and 10% other. Thank you all for being with us. We're now ready to start our conversation, and I am really excited about this. I've been looking forward to this ever since I've had the opportunity to read a Black women's history of the United States. So let's just jump right in. After about 30 minutes, we'll pause so that you all have an opportunity to meet one another and talk in small groups to share your thoughts with one another. I am happy to introduce Dr. Daina Ramey, history professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Kalina Gross, a professor of African American Studies at Emory University and the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University. Go RU. They are the co-authors of A Black Woman's History of the United States. Y'all, if you do not have this book, I'm telling you, it is a page turner. I couldn't put it down. So I'm so thrilled to be able to dig into conversation and ask you some questions that I have that came up in the book. So let's jump right in. While the dominant narrative in many history textbooks begins with Black history in the United States with enslavement, your book actually begins before the 1600s and discusses how the first Black women who were on this land were not enslaved. And so what does the dominant narrative miss or leave out when it begins Black women's history in the United States in 1619?
First of all, thank you so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here. And our goal was to show that Black people were free before they were enslaved. I mean, put it simply, is that Black people did not only come here as enslaved people. Their role in the early history of what became the Americas was not solely about enslavement. It was also about movement about travel, about independence, about freedom. And we really wanted to start the book off like that. Even the people of African descent that came here beyond 1619, and some of them that came enslaved, they were free people before they were captured and traded and sold into enslavement. And I think that's a very important distinction for our young kids, and for teaching younger learners to understand that, so that Black people are not seen from the beginning as people that are captive and that have no agency and that are responding to and reacting to that captivity. The Black people were free first. So it was really important for us to start with Isabel Del Vera as a free woman of African descent who comes here demanding justice, comes to what becomes the United States, it was New Spain at the time, and to come here on her own and to travel here on her own. And we felt like that was really important. And I'm sure my co-author, Dr. Gross, would add a few things to that maybe.
You know, I actually think you covered it all really well. I mean, it definitely was super important to kind of begin a narrative from this different place. And that sort of proclamation, that demand for justice really is something that motivated us to really look at the ways that Black women continue to sort of fight for and demand justice throughout all of the periods of study. I mean, that definitely became one of the sort of through lines throughout the book that I think actually runs right up into today.
Is there another question? I wasn't sure if I froze.
It wouldn't let me unmute myself.
Oh.
So we were pausing. Yes. And so that actually is a really great segue into my next question, because one of the quotes that I pulled from your book, and even just thinking, I know Dr. Berry, you had named Isabel Del Vera, and just that beginning quote in the book, "I demand justice," I got chills reading that. And so another quote that brings me to this moment in conversation is you say, "Whether challenging segregation in education or in public spaces, Black women and Black girls were on the front lines where new laws were translated into change daily practices." And so while Black women throughout history have been over-policed and underprotected, there are many ways that Black women have always resisted oppression and fought for justice. So you talk about Isabel Del Vera petitioned for a document that protected her before she even embarked on a journey with Spanish explorers. You talk about Mumbet, who worked alongside an attorney to win the first successful freedom suit in Massachusetts history. We've talked a lot in this series with Dr. Jean Theo-Harris and Jesse Hagopian about Rosa Parks and how Rosa Parks supported Mrs. Reese Taylor and Gertrude Perkins in their cases against sexual violence. So can you highlight for us some of the stories of how Black women have pursued justice through the courts and or by speaking on their experiences publicly despite backlash?
Dr. Gross, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. And I think, so, you mentioned some of the earlier pieces. I'd like to start actually in the post-emancipation period, if that's okay. I mean, one of the moments that sort of sticks in my mind is certainly just after the Civil War and after the riots in Memphis in 1866, where you have, huge swaths of the Black cities community destroyed, brutalized by anti-Black violence, particularly aimed at sort of, Black Union soldiers and people who are affiliated with them, but also a number of white police officers, and white folks just sort of decimated this community. And in a part of that process, they also sort of, waged a reign of sexual violence against Black women. So there are endemic rapes that also occur during this riot. And one of the things that's so powerful about it is that afterward, you have 5 Black women who testified before a Senate committee to talk about those experiences and to go on record and say that they did not consent. And that, may seem, it was a huge deal at the time, because it was really sort of one of the first sort of times that Black women were able to sort of legally lay claim to their own bodies, and say that they did not consent. And it's not that that was the first time that they tried to do this. You certainly have like examples of Celia, an enslaved Black woman, Missouri in 1855, who, after being serially raped by her owner, actually kills him and burns him in a fireplace. And during her trial, they try to, advance this defense that she was, trying to, protect herself against these attacks. And the court basically finds that she's not entitled to do so. And she ends up condemned to death. So that's sort of this, moment during enslavement. And so then we have this post-enslavement period where you have these women go on record and say they don't consent before the Senate committee, and have that being recognized. So that's sort of two examples, I think, of sort of during enslavement and then immediately after, where we see those. But you even have, and it isn't just around sort of sexual violence, you also have these instances where, and we actually talked about this before, but Black women also have protested things like segregated busing. Even before we have this sort of heroic, historic march, you have Black women like Viola White, refusing and being arrested in the 1940s, and then actually trying to appeal that conviction and dealing with horrible retaliation. Her daughter is brutally, sexually assaulted by police. They retaliate. They basically like stall the case, so it just doesn't go anywhere in the courts. But then, 10 years later, you have, 5 Black women come together under Browder v. Gale to once again kind of run up that hill, right? And they go through, this time the district court to, again, try to, protest this sort of segregated busing. And finally, they actually get, a win that helps to sort of end segregated busing, like in Montgomery. And so those are just some of the examples, of these places where you have Black women going to the courts and using them. And it's not always certainly a win, but one of the things that I'm just in awe of is that they're not deterred. That, I mean, and that's not to say that they don't have discouraged, that there isn't frustration, heartbreak, disappointment, because I don't want Black women to come off as superhuman either. I think that denies their humanity. Like, if we try to make them seem like they're just heroic and, no matter what, they just keep foraging through. No, I mean, Black women have continued to fight, but a lot of times it is at great cost. But one of the things I do remain in awe of is that even when there are those hurdles or those obstacles, that you do have folks they'll regroup and come back and continue to try to push forward.
I want to just add, I just put in, as Dr. Gross was talking, I was putting in some resources into the chat, some of these freedom suits during slavery, websites that I use all the time that I share with other educators that I think will be really useful, where you can pick and choose different stories that you can share with your students. And some of these women we talk about in the book, like Belinda Sutton, we talk about her, we open up one of the chapters with her. Then there's also a number of freedom suits from women in and around DC. Those are really interesting stories. This is a website that was created by some folks, and I think it was in Kentucky. So there's some really, really wonderful resources there where students can actually look at these primary documents and see how Black women were fighting for their freedom. And I think what Dr. Gross brings up is really important, is that she's showing that this is a battle that's ongoing, and we're still seeing it. I mean, you could even bring that up to someone like Anita Hill, fighting for her own freedom of work in the workspace and to be treated respectfully. There's a number of women that we can talk about, contemporary women that are here now that are fighting for freedom. And so I think it's important to define those kind of broadly, like we do in the book. And then also think about, there's a large spectrum or continuum of these battles to fight for freedom and equality that we see and that we tried to highlight throughout the book. Also, I think famous people like Sojourner Truth, she's fighting for her freedom and also the freedom of her children. She goes and gets her son who was taken away, and goes to a grand jury and testifies in front of a grand jury to get her son back. And it took almost 2 years for her to do that. But that's something that we also highlight, is this level of motherhood activism, of moms being activists, fighting for the rights for themselves and for their children. And that is another theme that we talk about through all the time periods in the book that I think would be useful for students to think about.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. The only thing I would just chime in to say is, and this jogged my memory here, when Dr. Berry mentioned like the continuum of Anita Hill, I was thinking about, right, that in some respects that we also need to understand her along this continuum of Sandra Bundy, who was one of the first folks, right, who basically sues in 1977 in DC, the Department of Corrections, because she had been repeatedly sexually harassed on the job. And so in 1977, that case was a real long shot, but they actually win, and it helps us create the legislation to have sexual harassment on the job be considered a part of sex discrimination in the employment place. So that's some of that context too, for how we then, get up into 1991 with Anita Hill. So thanks for that question. It's a great question. And hopefully these muddled answers are helping these teachers. I'm sorry, it's so disconcerting. You're looking at the person, but you get distracted by how you look yourself. It's horrible.
I try not to look at myself. It's hard.
I commend all you teachers now currently teaching online. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah, I would love to just take a quick moment to thank all the teachers here, because I know the work that you're putting in is not always being rewarded, and you're putting yourself at risk, and you're having to be creative, and you're having to spin on a dime. So we just want to commend you and thank you for the hard work that you all have been doing since about a year ago today, and how that the policies have had to change, and we've had to just move and change. We're getting it at the college level, but we know that you're teaching the generation of you're teaching our children. So we just want to both thank you for what you're doing and what you continue to do. We both have school-age children, so we understand. And my child is tired of Zoom as much as I can be sometimes, but I can't imagine with you all having to create lesson plans and find all kinds of ways to creatively engage your students. So thank you. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
My heart is bursting with so much joy at all the teachers that consistently show up to these conversations that teach people's history in their classrooms and at home and in their communities every single day. And we are so, so grateful.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I just want to highlight that you all have illuminated for everyone, and one thing that is so, so clear in the book is the continuum, right? And so even as you're sharing these different stories, I'm thinking about moments in the book where I was like, oh, I never knew that, right? Because it was all on a continuum, but the stories oftentimes don't get uplifted. So I'm thinking about the story of Harriet Scott that you share, about Harriet Scott, Dred Scott's wife, if I'm correct, who was the name was taken off of the case when it was repealed. And so thinking about these moments in time where Black women have been truly at the helm, but then erased in these very tangible, visible ways. And so I'm thinking about how this funnels into the next question about how throughout history, Black women have faced misogyny and sexism, even in organizations and movements aimed at Black freedom and liberation, such as the March on Washington, and were brushed aside by white suffragists who believed that they were better suited for the right to vote than Black men and women. And so can you talk about some of these moments in history where Black women's voices were largely left out in movements, although they played critical roles in organizing and sustaining these movements for freedom?
Absolutely. Do you want I'll just start off briefly and looking at the suffrage movement, particularly because we hit the anniversary this year. A lot of people did not recognize or didn't know the work that Black women were doing. They formed their own suffrage clubs because they tried to fight with the suffrage movement with white women's organization were often marginalized. We know that Ida B. Wells was told to march in the back of the parade, although she had been organizing with a group of other Chicago women, and she refused to do that. And so what we find is that Black women developed their own organizations. They also worked with white women in other organizations, but when they didn't find that their issues were being treated as paramount and as equal to white women's challenges, they then formed their own organizations. But they also felt discrimination within their own community. And we see that, and I'll let Dr. Gross talk about some of that, but we see that within the Montgomery bus boycott movement. We see that in Shirley Chisholm's campaign for presidency. And so there's a multiple, we talk about Black women and intersectionality and how their experiences hinge upon a number of ways where they intersect as women, as female, depending on their sexuality, all kinds of different ways in which women, whether or not they're differently abled. There's a number of different factors that Black women have to keep in mind that they're serving, and they can't always, and we don't choose one over the other. And so you see that coming out within activist movements as well. So I'll let Dr. Gross, I know she's got lots of great examples on this.
No, I actually want to give context to the two that you mentioned, because I think it is important. So, when we think about the civil rights movement, there is this way that Black women sort of get kind of written out. Either it's this sort of singular focus on Rosa Parks. And I think, Dr. Theo Harris's work does a brilliant job about sort of, dislodging, that whole sort of exploding that myth to really demonstrate this decades long sort of, legacy of grassroots activism, of contesting, sort of challenging rape and working on all these, just incredible, phenomenal freedom fighter for decades, not just someone who got tired and, decided to stand up by sitting down one day and this sort of thing. So, but even with that aside, the fact is Black women have been kind of strategists and sort of foot soldiers and organizing. And the bus boycott is sort of, is one of those examples, but also, we know that they organized throughout things like SNCC, right, as well. I know we have some folks from SNCC here. So these are the other examples where you have Black women who are sort of, at the kind of the forefront of all of these movements. And then when you do have these moments like the March on Washington, where there's this recognition, it's like they're allowed to be there, but they don't want them to make a speech, and someone's giving them sort of like this canned speech. But even then, I sort of feel like there's a way in which, even in reading that, there's sort of lay claim to the same, there's a fire to me that comes out in spite of it. So that sort of that one moment. And then again, there are women like Shirley Chisholm who, had this sort of audacity to just really, push past so many different things, whether even before she does this heroic run for the presidency, she also had to contend with all kinds of racism and sexism when she was beginning her political career, right? People had sort of, chided her as being like a little school teacher and who's interested in even interviewing you when you're running for these roles. But she knew how to organize. She, worked, her grassroots networks, mobilized her community, met people outside of projects, shopping centers, the supermarket, you name it. Really sort of pressed that, put that foot to the pavement and basically pulled out a win, which was like this major upset. So this is even before she runs for the presidency. And then even then, as sort of, pretty much like a protest candidate, but really calling attention to these issues that impact Black and Latinx communities, poor people, working class whites, all the rest, you still had contingents who were uneasy about her taking on that role, right? And that was among sort of like folks, even like the Black Caucus, not being able to get behind her. The Black Panthers were able to support her presidency, but these other folks were not, right? Because somehow, as if, it was you know, the idea was that, you know, she would never win. But it was like, no one, you know, none of you all would either. Like, why not get behind her presidency? So it was, again, this nexus. But at the same time, you had white feminist organizations also being sort of apprehensive about how far to take their support of her campaign as well. So there's this way in which Black women's activism has always sort of been at these difficult intersections. So I think one of the things that we balanced out with the book is trying to, and usually I'm the person who goes to the dark, the morbid side of things, because I feel like we want to have truth, that we can't run from the ugliness, right, and the pain. But at the same time, I also realize, if anything, in learning and doing these histories, is that there's a particular way in which sisters have learned how not to rest in that. And that they've, you know, and so that, as disappointing as some of those like sexist or misogynistic or misogynoir type of sort of lack of support actually is, they still, you know, organize collectively and work well with each other to kind of continue to move forward and to do incredible things. I mean, one of the things I still am in awe of is when, you know, they had kind of like teamed up with the senator from Massachusetts, like to try to push back against like the ways that Black voters were being disenfranchised during like the 1920s, right, with the Tinkham bill. I still think it's a brilliant idea, right, that they were trying to get congressional reapportionment to be based upon the number of ballots cast, not the number of people in the state, as this way to combat voter suppression. Right. And I think, you know, I thought it was like, I mean, you know, of course, you know, this act goes down in flames, but still, I think it was a brilliant idea. You know, Black women worked with him on this. They helped canvass and get like testimonies of people to talk about the ways that they have been disenfranchised. So, you know, they don't necessarily get credit for like, you know, help being architects of the Tinkham bill. But they absolutely were. So those are these spaces where I find that I've been resting a lot more in how I think and look at this history.
I love something that you said, Dr. Gross, about emphasizing the fire, right? And it reminds me of one of my favorite Ella Baker quotes, "Give light and people will find the way." And I think that that's what Black women have always done, is given off this fire, given off this light on this continuum that you highlight so powerfully for us in the book. And so earlier we were talking too about the importance of providing the nuance and complexities in Black women's experiences, not just thinking about, as you just said, not just thinking about the pain, but also about the power, about the art. And so one of my favorite aspects of the book, being an artist myself, is how Black women have always used art. And so Black women have used art from hair, you talk about the Tignon laws, to poetry, to visual arts, to dance, to music, and so much more as mechanisms for truth-telling, resistance, and also for healing. So can you speak a little bit to Black women's art as a tool for understanding what you call Black women's inner lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we covered Black women artists from every time period that we in the book. So many people know about Phillis Wheatley and her poems, and what we learn about art, whether it's visual art, whether it's music or painting or sculptures, it's a form of expression, and it's sort of another, as a historian, it's another source to understand a person in a particular time period. And so for us, it just adds another layer of texture to understanding Black womanhood and or the things that were important to that particular woman. So we talk about people like Augusta Savage. We talk about other artists that were making changes and looking at art as a way to express themselves and to find a space for themselves in society. So I think that was really key for us throughout the book.
Yeah, I would just add that there are a couple of a few artists that I would want to highlight. I mean, certainly like I like the queer artist Edmonia Lewis, right, in the antebellum era, becomes really, she's a sculptor, but she also is really deeply impressed with and ensconced with these ideas around abolitionism. So she also makes these medallions of like, prominent abolitionists. So there's this way in which her art is also, this political kind of expression. But also thinking about sort of performers as well. So even early performers like Cierra Jones, who, this is in like the 1890s, right? Is performing. She actually performs in the White House at certain points, but she also travels abroad diasporically. That was the thing that I was blown away by. She forms her own troupe. They perform throughout the Caribbean and certain parts of South America, Guyana. Hey. My family's from Guyana, so I have to shout it out. But she goes abroad and performs, and just does has this like, incredible career. Again, Augusta Savage, as Dr. Barrett mentioned, this is a woman who kind of remade herself from sort of being married really young and having a child to finding a way to sort of lose her husband, take her kid, move to New York, go, study at Cooper Union, reinvent herself, starts referring to her daughter as her sister. She starts lying about her age, she just kind of remakes herself in the city, but she also embraces like Black nationalism. She helps to sort of democratize art by organizing and creating like whole art centers that are aimed at sort of teaching anyone who wants to know about art how to become an artist and just making it accessible for Black people. Just this brilliant kind of mind. But even like just Black women writers, we talk about like Zora Neale Hurston and Ann Petrie, who are kind of getting at Black women's interiorities and also like the complexities about like life and racism in the urban North. And then there are like the Black queer performers from, like the Harlem Renaissance era who, we think it's interesting. Like when I teach students in classes and we look at like some of the lyrics in hip hop, and yes, they are problematic. Deeply, right? Misogynistic, materialistic, right? Violent and vulgar. But they had their rivals in the 1920s too, where you have certain lyrics that were also really sexualized and vulgar, explicit, and drinking about getting drunk and high and bathtub gin and cutting folks with razors during fights, right? So, there's a way in which, there's this trajectory. And on one hand, certain points, it is problematic, but it does also open up a world and a window onto like Black life and culture in sort of its vibrancy and its flawed complexities, and in a way that's not just always like referential to whiteness. Right. That's one of the things that I love about Black artists and Black art is that it is both political and is completely cognizant of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Right. There's no question about that. But they still find a way to root it in the Black experience. And even when like these blues women are singing, some of them are talking about like Black Eyed Blues, they're talking about domestic violence and other kinds of issues. Like it's this way in which they use these platforms to talk about some of those issues. Sometimes they talk about like, arrests, they sing about poverty, right? These are these spaces that are about sounding some of those hard parts of life, right? And so this is this way that I think promotes sort of healing by kind of exercising some of those demons at the same time that they take some of those hard, ugly experiences and weave it into something beautiful.
And I would just add, this is completely going a little bit further back. I just put a few things in the chat of women seamstresses. And that's a form of art, and it was a skill that Black women had that gave them different kinds of freedoms and that gave them access to other aspects of society, whether they were in slavery or in freedom. So I have, for those that are teaching younger children, Grace Wisher, who helped make the first flag, the Star Spangled Banner flag. And we also have someone like Elizabeth Keckley, who was a seamstress in the White House. So these are just two examples of other forms that I would consider of an art form or expression or skill that Black women had. And they use that to express themselves. But also when you look at Black women that were fighting for freedom, a number of enslaved women who self-liberated is what I call, instead of saying running away. I don't like to call them fugitives because they were stealing a freedom that was stolen from them. So I like to think about them as women that are liberating themselves from captivity that they were illegally brought into. A number of those women that had been seamstresses took the dresses that they made and produced because they felt like those were their own. And oftentimes they took them not only to blend into free society, but also because they felt like it was rightfully theirs. So there's a certain level of pride that they had in the craftsmanship of making these dresses. And I just wanted to add that, although that jumps way back into the antebellum and colonial era.
Yeah, there are so many rich stories in the book and in history. And as you're talking about the different ways that art has been used by Black women throughout history, I just am always in awe of thinking about the Tignon laws, where Black women of color, had to wrap their hair to signify that they were part of a quote unquote lesser class. And then instead they were like, we're gonna wear the brightest flyest wraps with beads, and we're using this as a form of resistance and standing in our most authentic truths in ourselves. And so I'm always brought back to that moment in time and thinking about how you all have illuminated the continuum about how that shows up today through racist and sexist dress code policies that continue, right? And yet we still continue to resist. So one thing that you all brought up that I want to make sure to highlight here too is lifting up the queer and trans women that you talk about in the book. And so the book notes that narrow gender expectations for Black women have been another form of oppression. I think of the stories in the book that highlight Gladys Bentley, Polly Murray, Marsha P. Johnson, and how they defied rigid social constructions of gender. And so can you lift up some of the stories of the queer and trans folks that are often left out of textbooks?
I would love for Dr. Gross to tell the story about Frances Thompson, because this is actually, I mean, can you nerd out just a little bit though and talk about the discovery of the record? I know that might not be something that everybody appreciates, but it is like, it's in the book, but there's such a larger story that I think it's important. Like even with Isabel Del Vera, to have to find her story took us a year we were learning about it, but we spent a year doing research to flesh that chapter out. And this other story about Frances Thompson, I think, is really, really important. So, and that was your research find. So I got to let you.
I was trying not to nerd out.
Yes, all the nerding out.
Right? We're supposed to be trying to help the teachers, not go on a geek trail with me. But I'll see how we're doing time-wise. So yes, Frances Thompson. It's one of, it's a really important story because Frances Thompson, I mentioned, is actually one of the women who went on record to testify to being sexually assaulted during the Memphis riots in 1866. And as a result of that testimony, she kind of becomes persona non grata among local authorities. She's routinely harassed and she gets, kind of questioned, and she's on suspicion for everything from like running a house of disrepute to supposedly illegally selling hoodoo bags. You name it, they have sort of accused her of everything. And in 1876, the more serious allegations really start to dog her, this idea that she is actually a man in woman's clothing. Now, she had been able to sort of elude those suspicions for a long time. They had been kind of lodging them. In 1876, she actually is arrested and subjected to a series of invasive examinations in which they proclaim that she is in fact biologically male. She is arrested for cross-dressing, even though she maintains that she is of double sex and had lived her life for at least the last 20 years as a woman. She was imprisoned. And, you know, initially she was forced to like labor outside as a part of that sentence. And so people would come by and ridicule her and ask her rude questions about her gender, to which she would respond, none of your damn business, you know, even, you know, maintain that fight. But, you know, again, it's at great cost. She survives her sentence, but she takes ill shortly thereafter and dies in November of that year. So it is, you know, this important story too, because I think it kind of sketches out this beautiful phrase. I was on a panel with a transgender prison activist, Cece McDonald, and one of the things that I remember her saying was that she really wanted to know more about her ancestry. And so it was something about her saying that turn of phrase, it made me realize that I had come across a number of cases throughout history that might be able to sort of fit or sketch out that, you know, along that continuum. So telling that story and others like it with respect to Gladys Bentley, certainly Paulie Marshall and Marsha P, of course, we, you know, it was phenomenal. And Edmonia, right, in the antebellum era, like these, it was absolutely necessary to have those stories be included and throughout the history, not just until we get to like 1990 or something. But with respect to my nerd trail, so I've been kind of like longing to find like some sort of image of Frances Thompson. I mean, it's 1876, you know, she was an ex-slave, you know, the ex-enslaved woman. So the chances of me finding anything would be like nil. And I just happened to kind of like go online, you know, and looking for, you know, Frances Thompson, you know, anyone's having documents, eBay pops up. I never used this site really. And lo and behold, someone's selling a copy of a paper, The Day's Doings. It's a rare paper. And they actually have 1876, and I look it up. And lo and behold, there are these engravings of guess who? Frances Thompson, 1876. My friends, could not believe it. And so that is how Frances Thompson's image is able to be in the book, and it's under an article where it says Francis, you know, with the IS, you know, who was living rather than the ES and this sort of thing. It's, you know, some of the captions are like the Negro who lived, you know, man who lived as a woman for 20 years. So it was an incredible sort of find to be able to even see some sort of image of her. It was very, you know, one of those finds like in history that you'll never forget, like a historian. So that was my geek trail.
Ooh, one of the questions that I have for you all is thinking about who are some of the lesser known women in the book that you would want educators specifically to learn more about and teach their students about? There are so many incredible women in this book. And so if we were to think about some of the women that we would want to highlight in our classrooms, who would you like to uplift in this moment?
I always say, and we have questioned some of this, I always say that there's so many women that we mention in this book, women and girls at various ages, and depending on what age group you're teaching, it seems like it's really an opportunity to focus in on someone that your students might relate to. But for me, the story of Mary Colbert, who was a young girl that we opened up in the Civil War chapter, where she was hiding some of the family jewels in her apron. And she makes a statement that was just so powerful, and that, you know, the troops were coming through and looking for the family jewels and riches, and they hid them in her apron, and no one even looked at her. And she said, no one even took a second glance at me. They didn't even know that a little Black girl was holding all the family heirlooms. And I think that's a powerful moment for us as scholars of Black women's history, to think about how Black women have often been overlooked and ignored when they're in spaces that are very public. And I think that's one of my favorite stories, but there's a ton of other women that Callie and I kept in the book, of unnamed women, of women who we didn't know much about, but we knew something that they did historically that was amazing. And we felt like even if we didn't know their names, their stories were very important for us to continue to tell. So that would be my response to that.
Thanks. This is a great question. So I have like ones that I usually do, but I think that I'm gonna try to branch out. I'm gonna branch out a little bit. I'm actually gonna talk about Callie House, who is one of these early forerunners of the reparations movement. So usually, you know, when we think about reparations, it's like a very sort of presentist conversation. And folks don't realize that, you know, Black folks were organizing around this issue as early as 1898. House was herself formerly enslaved. And one of the things that she is horrified by is sort of the state of elderly formerly enslaved people, how destitute they are. So they start to organize collectively, and they form the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association, to basically start to press for some sort of reparations for all of these formerly enslaved people, right? And she canvasses the country and talks about it. They fundraise, they use the Postal Service. Yes. And basically, I see it going up in the chat now. Absolutely. Yes. And so, you know, she helps to really grow this organization from like 34,000 to over 300,000. But she also is basically criminalized for her activism. There are a series of agencies from the Treasury Department, Fed, who are like horrified at the prospect. And so they basically sort of get her on like these trumped up fraud charges, saying that she's using the Postal Service to defraud people because there's no way this could be real and all the rest. And so she actually is imprisoned for about a year or so before she ends up becoming sick and passes away from cancer. But she is an incredible figure who I think is one of these sort of, there was a book about her by Dr. Mary Frances Berry that came out that's a brilliant work, but she's not like a household name. And she really should be. And that said, just one of the other things too, just about the book in terms of resources, thinking about the educators, we didn't have the language for it at the time, like a community history, but in some ways that's what this book was. I mean, we had a lot of sister scholars read our drafts and outlines and meet with us and give us feedback, and we rely heavily on their scholarship. And so we use their resources in ways that if people see something they're interested in our sites, our footnotes, and these are the places where you can go and follow up on these incredible stories. We also tried to cite things like documentaries, literally quote those that are readily available. So these are also ways that you can incorporate those materials into your classes as well.
I love that you bring that up, because reading that part of the book where you talk about the sisterhood scholarship, right? Leaning on one another, coming together, reminds me a lot of our relationship with so many of the teachers that are part of this conversation, right? Leaning on one another for lessons, for resources, for citations, for just feedback. And so I would actually love if you would share a little bit more about what that process was like for you all to bring so many different scholars together, and what did that look like in practice? Because it's such a beautiful story from what I've read, so I'd love to hear it.
It was one of the most enriching days of our academic careers. We both have shared that, to have scholars of various generations who were at different ranks and at different types of institutions, 10 Black women scholars come for more than, we were there all day at Rutgers University. Dr. Gross organized this, and we gave them, the manuscript. And when I say manuscript, I'm using that term loosely because some chapters were scraps of disjointed stories and outlines. Others were different stories that we wanted to tell and sources, and others were full drafted chapters that were rough. And we put ourselves
very rough.
Yeah, very rough. We were very vulnerable to have to share that, but we wanted to make sure that the stories we were telling, that we were telling the right stories, and that we were getting feedback from our peers and people that were our elders whose shoulders we stand on. to make sure that we were covering everything. And there's so many other scholars that are coming behind us that are doing phenomenal work in Black women's history. And this field itself is probably the fastest growing field within American history. Do you want to say more about that day?
I mean, I would just echo everything you said, and just to say it was really like this incredible display of sisterhood. I mean, we spent hours talking about these issues, and I can tell you, we felt an immense pressure to try to like get this right. I mean, we say at the outset, like, this book isn't meant to be the end all be all, right? We're hoping that our book will be the place where you start your journey in terms of learning about Black women's history, not where it ends. So, it's written in that way, and we, tried to use as many sources as available, primary sources, but also to highlight these other phenomenal works. And so those sister scholars were also like, they were cutting edge in their own fields. We had legends, who read drafts for us, as well as junior scholars who just produced amazing scholarship. And it was an incredible experience for me personally. And yeah, to be able to trust them, with, some rough, raggedy writing, and know that you aren't going to be like, burned in effigy for it. But that we all really worked together, because I think everyone had a sense of the seriousness with which we were approaching this project. Like, everyone wanted to do a good job and to find ways to really do right in telling Black women's history. So it was a really powerful experience.
And then I just want to add one more thing. There was a question in the chat about our collaborative process. Yeah. And I think that kind of moves into that, if that's okay. Because we were at the same institution when we first started the book, we were also working on our second single author book project. So this book took us about 7 years to write. Because another book, our individual books came out in between this process. But we spent a lot of time talking about themes, talking about structure, deciding who we wanted to cover, why we wanted to cover certain people. Do we do a typical timeline? Do we do a timeline that's different because Black women's history sort of moves along a different schedule than other forms of history? And so there was a lot of back and forth. And then when we were at different institutions, we would have phone calls, meetings, we'd meet up at conferences, we'd share, versions of different drafts of different sections of chapters and get feedback from one another, send it out. And then Dr. Gross was really good at making sure at the end, we were just getting out different chapters of different scholars. Okay, this person is doing this work. Let me have her read this. And we were just randomly asking folks, okay, look, can you read chapter 3? Can you read chapter 6? Can you read chapter 8? So we really wanted to make sure that we were hitting all the marks right. And that's how I would describe our process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would again echo all of that and just sort of say, Daina and I both, we are Black women's historians, and we have certain ways we have specific kinds of expertise, right? And mine was about Black women in the criminal justice system, as well as sort of, the latter half of, African-American history. But, in order to do this work, we really reached out to a lot of sister scholars far and wide who are expert on, sort of targeted kinds of areas. Because we wanted to make sure that what we had was correct and that we were doing our sort of due diligence. So they graciously read chapters and gave feedback at the last minute. And then also too, in terms of the balancing aspect, I said before, I'm usually the person who kind of goes to the dark side. Like, I tell, I don't want to sugarcoat anything. I want to, have every lash, every injury, every violent, person. And Daina, for such a heavy topic is actually the, optimistic, right? Daina's personality is different. So we would have to really battle and figure out how to get the balance right. We had to get, Daina had to talk me in off the ledge a few times. Like, we want people to read this book, not be like beaten down or like totally depressed by it. Mm-hmm. So,
remember we were going to start off with a Black woman being murdered. Like the yes. opening story was this woman getting killed. And we were like, wait a minute.
That was my passion that I really wanted to start with.
Yeah, we
With-
thought, okay, wait a minute, we want people to read past that first paragraph.
right, like as this way to read back, but it's true. I don't know that people would have read if it wasn't, and it doesn't mean that we didn't include stories that were hard.
Yeah.
Definitely, they are there.
The slave trade and just the
Yeah.
descriptions of the Middle Passage, and even having that there multiple chapters of the slave trade. That was a question, like, why is the slave trade in chapters 1 through 3? It's because Black women were being brought over in all of those time periods. They didn't just come at one point and were dropped off. So we
Right.
wanted to reflect that, and that was
Mhm.
hard. We don't want to lose readers, but we also need to tell the truth. And
Exactly. I mean,
so,
or even like, the
Right.
execution of Corrine Sykes in 1946, Black woman with special needs, right? So there definitely, those stories are there, but I do think we struck a right balance in that respect, and that came through the collaborative process 100% with each other and with a broader community of scholars, for sure.
Yeah. And on that note, I'm seeing a follow-up question in the chat box. And as you talk about these painful moments in history, and you carry these stories with you. And so do either of you feel in the carrying of these stories, just the magnitude and the weight and trauma from the research and learning about the stories that haven't been told?
oh, wow, that's a great question. I'm glad. I think it was put in there twice. I'm glad we have time to answer it. We both write about Black women experiencing violent trauma, both in our own individual research. And we both experienced family loss. Callie lost her mother and I lost my father during the writing process. And that made it really raw to have our own personal loss, but we were also writing about other people's losses. And then we were seeing violence and other kinds of forms of physical and sexual abuse. We were also writing about that. And it is very difficult at times. There are times where we both couldn't write. I remember there was one time where she called me, she's like, I'm dry right now. I can't get anything out. And I called her about 3 weeks later. I'm like, I'm right there with you. And the deadline was extended. This book should have come out sooner, but we needed more time. And so, yes, we do carry it. I have found ways, and everybody has their own way of doing it, to try to find ways to successfully be able to navigate the heaviness of the research that we write about. And some days I'm more successful than others. Some days I don't feel like talking to people. I just don't feel like, I'm just not in the mood. Like I'm full with whatever emotion because I'm carrying something so heavy and I'm just not in the mood. And there are other times where I need to work out. I need to go run. That's what I do. I run. I also do like totally mindless TV, which is why I'm looking forward to watching the Harriet and Meghan interview after this, because I need to do something that takes me completely away from the realities of enslavement, which is what I spend most of my days in. And so I need to get out of that and go completely far. I watch a lot of comedy, and those are some of my coping mechanisms. And I'm trying to get back into yoga, which is what I did during graduate school, and meditation. So those are my methods.
Sure. And I'll just answer really quick. It is difficult. And there were times, I'm also a mindless TV person as a way to try to escape it. I also sadly like to eat my pain. So I definitely gained some weight writing this book. Food and drink, Netflix, and all these things were my lifeblood. I'm not the type who will automatically go run instead. So it is difficult. It is hard, but it is also a part of, I don't want to dismiss that because it's real, but it also is like, look, it's hard for me to write about it, but like these folks lived it. Like, at a certain point, like, and that is the other impetus, that where you have to kind of pull it back together and get back in front of the computer and find a way through. I mean, I transcribed Mamie Till's description of what she saw the first time when she looked at Emmett Till's corpse. And, I cried. Like I had to stop and take breaks and just like cried it out for a bit, and then went back and then, finished it. Then I had to listen to it again, and I was looking at it to make sure I got it right. Because at the same time, I also really wanted to honor her and her words. Like if she could sit there and like calmly recount this litany of horrible, horrific, brutality against this child, then I ought to be able to find it in me to make sure I transcribe it properly and cite that work. So yeah, it's intense, but it also, you know, right, somebody lived it. So I know we're supposed to go on, but in the time we have left, we actually wanted to turn the tables just a little bit and ask you, Cierra Kaler-Jones, a question, because I don't know if our audience is aware, but we are on the precipice of a newly minted PhD.
Woo-hoo!
Yes, she will be defending in a couple of weeks, and her own scholarship is very much, I think, related to the work that we do. So I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about that in the time we have remaining.
Thank you, Dr. Gross and Dr. Berry. And I'm going to have one more question for you both before we end. And I'm really honored to be able to share a little bit about my work. So my dissertation focuses on how Black girls use arts-based practices like movement, music, hair as forms of resistance of oppressive structures and systems, but also as identity construction. So together alongside high school age Black girls, my co-researchers, we created a virtual summer program and we explored Black history, Black feminist theory, community organizing, leadership, advocacy, and through the conversations that we were able to have in the program, we actually learned together how to code data and analyze data together. So we actually took the transcripts from our conversations, they collected oral history testimonies from their loved ones, and we took all of that data, coded and analyzed it together, and they took the themes that they had pulled out from the data and turned it into artwork. And the artwork, they presented it in a community art showcase to their loved ones. So I'm looking forward to, in a couple of weeks, sharing that. My dissertation's called "You Can't See Me by Looking at Me: Black Girls' Arts-Based Practices as Mechanisms for Identity Construction and Resistance." I've learned so much from working with young people, just the brilliance that continues to shine, the hope, but also the way that they make connections, right? Like as we were talking about the continuum today, they make that continuum so clear in the ways that they uplift history. And so they actually wanted to call the showcase that we put on, they wanted to call it #HistoryRewritten, because they wanted to center Black women's experiences in history. So it feels very fitting to be able to have this conversation just a couple of weeks from being able to defend the dissertation. And I only hope that I can do justice to their words and to the work that they do. But they've taught me about truly the principle of Sankofa, the Ghanaian principle of Sankofa, go back and get it. So knowing our history, so we can know ourselves in the present, to dream ourselves in the future. And throughout the program, they created artwork that was they created futures that were worthy in their minds of Black girl brilliance. So looking forward to being able to highlight that, and appreciate you all so much for putting me on the spot and allowing me to share that.
You
work.
are ready.
You're ready.
Oh,
You're ready. You're ready. Go get it.
Thank you.
Go get it. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. And you know, I am so grateful to you both for paving the way. Black women scholars, paving the way for other Black women scholars. I don't do this work alone. Ubuntu, I am because we are. So just thank you so much. Gratitude. So I know that we have only just a little bit of time left together. I have one more question to pull the conversation together. And for those that are still on the call, don't forget to fill out the evaluation form. But as we come into our last question, I love quotes. So I'll pull in one of the quotes from your book. You write, "Black women's history in its truest sense serves a historical roadmap of the failures of mainstream approaches to democracy and an incisive tutorial on how to correct it." And so what can we learn from the historical roadmap to both understand and teach the ongoing struggle for freedom?
Wow. So I'll start and just say that struggle has always been a part of Black women's experience in the United States. and that we understand and recognize it in various time periods, and that the freedoms that we're fighting for change. As we get more freedoms, we're fighting for new ways to be respected in society. And I think that that's one of the goals, that when we're looking at mainstream history books, that there's no excuse that there's not a Black woman in that time period, because we've identified a number of women that were activists and artists, entertainers, and just everyday human beings, mothers, daughters, sisters, that lived in the United States and contributed to our history. So that's my hope for this project.
For sure. I'll try to keep it short because I know we're running up against that time. I think they show the places where democracy has really sort of failed in terms of, you know, being exclusionary. It's one thing where we pay homage to these ideas, right, of liberty, right, life, liberty, you know, the pursuit of happiness and all the rest. But when it comes down to actually having freedom and true citizenship, there are all these spaces throughout the history where it's failed Black people and Black women especially. So I think their resistance helps to highlight those failures, and at the same time, all the ways that they have managed to change those structures to bring out more equitable treatment. Not that the problems are solved. We know that they have endured, and that, you know, these things happen and fit, right? Racial progress, social justice, a lot of times starts in fits and starts, right? It's not necessarily a linear process, but they've given us a really powerful blueprint in terms of thinking about activism, whether it's collective grassroots organizing, whether it's using the power of the press, and now what we have is social media, right? Where they're sort of organizing and taking, you know, seeking political office as a way to make change. We have Black women who advocated for self-defense and, you know, advocated that with respect to a Winchester rifle, right? If you think about Ida B. Wells, right? Before we have by any means necessary, we have Ida B. Wells telling everybody, make sure you own a Winchester rifle and have it as a prized place above your family hearth, right? We have examples of Black women going abroad to advocate for justice for Black people, so making our struggle global also. So we think about just all the many tactics that Black women have accessed and mobilized, right? From liberating themselves to all of the other approaches that I just laid out. Is why I say, if you look at that history, you have a blueprint for how to resist and how to continue to press and to keep moving forward.
Oof, a blueprint to resist. A historical roadmap that paves the way forward for all of us towards freedom, liberation, and communities and societies centered in love and justice and joy. And so we are nearing the end of our conversation, and I could talk to you all forever. But I know that with time limits, we must prepare to close. And I just want to quickly mention for everyone on the call, we have relevant lessons on the history of Black women at the Zinn Education Project, including the voting rights unit and the lesson on the long history of the demand for reparations. I also know that I've used Resistance 101 as one of the lessons in the program that I just described with high school students, and lifting up many of the stories that were in a Black woman's history of the United States.